They threw her to the pigs, believing that would finish her. They did not know what they had started. The Baron's farm sat like a painting of order and plenty, neat rows of grain, a lane lined with pollarded elms, outbuildings with whitewashed walls. From a distance, sun struck the copper of the granary roof, and the place spoke of discipline and wealth. Up close, the air tasted of manure and the thin smoke from a dozen hearths. Men and women moved like parts of a machine. Laughter was scarce, and the watchful faces of overseers kept the rhythm. Power here was measured in acres, in livestock, in the bend of a man's hand when he passed judgment. Kiana had learned to read that hand better than she read the sky. She had learned how to keep her eyes low, how to make her labor useful enough that the overseer would remember her usefulness before her name. She had learned the names of the fields that were safe and the barns where a man's stare lasted too long. She had learned the taste of fear like a second hunger. She had learned, too, the small stubbornness that kept her counting the hours until a shift ended, which, for a woman with a small secret under her coarse linen, had become an act of survival. The secret had worn itself into her bones. At first she wrapped it in a scarf and tucked it beneath an apron. Later she learned the tightness of breathing when the Baron came near. She had tried to disappear into work, to keep the world's eye averted, until the day when negligence was not the thing they punished, but the thing they displayed. It began with the harvest count, an accounting by the Baron himself that drew everyone out of the bundles and into the yard. He walked among them with a caliper precision, his boots scuffing dust, his cloak an assertion. He asked names by the barn door and called mutters false or true with a flick of his chin. Anna stood with a pitchfork in her hands, palms raw, shoulders aching from the morning. She kept her head down, as always. The Baron's gaze should have passed her, the way stormlight passes a reed. Instead, a small boy, a kitchen boy with a mouth full of mischief, pointed, and then a woman in the yard, who had never been kind, laughed. Whispers moved like insects. The overseer's face hardened. For a moment nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then the Baron stepped forward. "You carry other people's seed beneath that linen," he said. Not a question. The accusation clanged across the yard. Men stopped their work. The cattle tossed their heads in the distance, uneasy. Anna felt the ground wedge itself against her feet. A hand went to the spot where the secret lay, half to protect, half to steady herself. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than the whisper of straw. "It is not yours to name." Laughter, sharp and cruel, rippled. The Baron smiled the way a blade caught sun. "Names will be taught," he said. "Those who think themselves above the law must be taught." They did not take her to the stocks. The Baron wanted humiliation that would be noticed and recorded in the minds of every servant and tenant. He meant the message to be a lesson. You belong to us. He meant to show them how thoroughly their bodies, their secrets, even their futures, could be turned into spectacle. They led her to the pigsty as if escorting a prize. The cement of the yard made an unforgiving throat. The smell hit her like a slap, fermenting feed, the sour of animals kept for eating. Pigs shifted in the mud, their small black eyes reflecting the sun. They squealed and rooted with unknowing innocence. Anna smelled the warm, fetid weight of the place and felt a flush of bile rise. But what she felt most clearly was the temperature of her own rage. Not the restless hot flame of revenge, but the cold, hard steel of decision. Whatever he did to her would not decide whether she lived. "Strip her," the Baron commanded. He wanted the spectacle complete. Linen torn, body revealed, shame made visible. Someone brought her a stern look. Someone else found a thigh, grabbed cloth. Hands were rough and quick. The apron came away. For a flinging of moments she felt the air against skin that had not had any soft touch in months, and thought with a detached clarity of cloth at home, of Juon's laugh once, small recollections like coins in a pocket. The Baron's men dragged the cloth aside. The yard hummed. She understood their arithmetic. Humiliation is a currency that devalues courage in others. The Baron believed that to throw a person into filth is to wash them of hope. He believed a crushed spirit would be easier to bend. They dropped her into the pigsty. Mud clung to her knees, to the hem of the linen she still had around her waist. Pigs brushed her legs with their warm bodies, snuffling. The smell was a thing that filled nostrils and memory, pressing itself against the soft places in her skull. Laughter clanged like bells from the yard. The Baron took 2 steps back and announced, loud enough for the courtyard to hear, "Let this be a lesson. Your body is no longer your own." He lifted his chin as if to signal the end. Anna bit down on the taste of earth and listened to the Baron's voice fade into a coarse blur. She counted her breath. The baby inside her, she thought, did not know this world yet, did not know the measurement of cruelty people learned in such yards. That thought flared into something protective and fierce, and for the first time since news of the pregnancy had first shone on her body, she was not only small and frightened, she was a shield. A child has no bargain with the world. It only receives what is given. Anna decided then, with the small, sure calculus of a woman who has nothing left to lose, that she would not let someone else decide the ledger. If the Baron thought throwing her to the pigs would end her, he had misread the account. This would be the moment she wrote the first line of her own future. There were 2 practical things to do: wait for darkness and avoid the guards' paths, and make it far enough before anyone noticed she was gone. Pride would not serve her. Cunning and patience would. She let the pigs nudge her hands until she could stand, palms raw and slick. She kept the fold of linen over the swell of her belly and watched. When the last of the Baron's men had turned their backs and the shadows deepened, she moved. She climbed out when the ground was cooler. The yard at dusk smelled different, sweeter, full of the let-out breaths of a day. A few torches burned along the lane. A dog barked, saw a shape at the edge of the shadow, and fell to scratch the earth. Anna kept to the line of eaves, slipping into doorways, letting the steady noise of men's feet and the low murmur of a farmhouse lull and then leave without looking back. Her plan was not a grand one. It was a string of small evasions sewn together. A cart's shadow across the lane at the right moment, the thick hedge behind the granary that hid a gap, the lean tree which would not betray a small figure if she hugged its bark. She moved like a ghost among the things that had belonged to others all day. She ran when a dog gave a second bark. She crawled when a lantern passed too close. She kept counting her breaths so panic could not take root. The night clung to her like a cloak. Her clothes were still damp in places from the pigsty. The chill gnawed at her spine. She thought of Juan often in the hours when the stars showed, quick and indifferent. He had been taken when she was young, sold because a debt needed settling. She had traced his absence like a white scar across the map of her memory, sometimes imagining his hands on a different farm, sometimes believing he had seen the sun set over a distant sea. Thoughts of him were both a weight and a compass. They reminded her of what could be lost and why the loss mattered. She could not lose another person she might love. When she reached the boundary hedgerow, the guards' lamps were a pale smear in the distance. A moon washed silver over the corn, turning the field into a sea that moved soundlessly. She took the gap in the hedgerow and slipped into the field, feet sinking in damp earth. The world outside the Baron's lane was not safety, only possibility. Trees rose up like a promise in the near distance. A creek cut under the grasses, a place she had once used to wash an apron on a summer day. She made for it because it was a place she could read. A feature, not a threat. The forest met her like a slow intake of breath. The underbrush caught at her skirts. Branches dashed her face. Night insects stitched the dark with sound. She moved without the surety that came from someone born free to wander. Her joints ached. The hum of adrenaline hit and then faded, leaving a rawness that made her teeth ache. At the edge of the trees, the wind shifted, and she felt the coolness of water and the faint possibility of shelter under leafy boughs. She half laughed then, a raw sound that was more like an animal's cry than a human one. It was a sound of someone who had known only small mercies and had finally promised herself one, to keep going. She did not pretend the night was not full of danger. There were wolves in the deep woods sometimes, and gamekeepers who liked to sweep the lines at dawn. The Baron's men could be anywhere, but she could run faster through the trees than 2 men dragging lanterns. She could make herself vanish among roots and ferns. The child within her pressed with a slow, steady insistence against the place where she could still touch it. She spoke to it under her breath as she moved, naming things no word had yet named: wind, night, mother. The sound of her own voice steadied her. At a bend in the creek she paused, smelling water and the small green sweetness of crushed leaves. She crouched and drank, not so much out of thirst as to feel the sensation of cool on her tongue. Her hands trembled as she cupped water. When she looked up, the moon had dipped, clouds had brushed it, and there was not the assurance of a sky to navigate by. Still she pressed on, picking the lowland where the underbrush thinned and the path would be easier to follow. She had not gone far when a pain, light at first, bloomed in her side. It was like a dull stone that had been placed there to mark her progress. She thought, in a flash of terrible clarity, of the night in the pigsty and the jar of that memory, and realized that the pain was not from an old bruise but from the strain of running while pregnant, from the cold that tightened her muscles until they clenched. She slowed recklessly, and then dropped to a mossy bank. The world tilting made the trees sway. She put a hand to her belly and breathed. She did not want to accept the weakness. She had been taught that to admit need was to invite it to take root. But the baby's tiny, anonymous movements answered her fingers, and she found her voice again, small and fierce. "I will not let them take you," she whispered, because in the dark, promises to the unborn sounded less foolish than they did in the light. A sliver of dawn penciled the eastern sky when she crept forward again. She learned to walk the way one learns to read a person's footsteps. She could do it by listening, by knowing the cadence of men at night. She skirted the lane now, where the hedgerow thinned to a line and the world opened to fields and a distant rise, in which a lone house stood, the manor of a different sort. She kept to the ditch lines, to the shadows of hedgerows, and avoided the farm tracks. When a cart rolled past, she froze and let the horse's heavy smell pass over her. Her breath held until the wood creaked and the wheels churned away. She moved again, slower now, every nerve sharp with the need to be unseen. She could have tried to steal into the night toward some town, or risk the road where thieves might lie in wait. Instead, she chose the wild edge of the land toward the tree line, and the rumor she had heard once over a cup of watery soup. A castle, old and quiet, where a duke or a man of title kept to himself. People had said he was odd, a recluse who had parted from the world and let his lands fall to shadow. The rumor had seemed to her then like fiction, an entertaining story that might come at the end of a long night. Now it became a map. The idea of a human being who sheltered himself from the world had an appeal. Perhaps a person who had chosen solitude had chosen compassion too. Or perhaps, at the very least, such a place would not be the Barrens, and that difference was enough. By noon the next day she was deep in the trees, where the light that found ground was a pale green. She had not slept for long. The night watched her like a strict judge. Her feet were raw, her calves a rope of tight pain. She had foraged, a berry here, a sprig of herb there, tasting them with a thrust of caution and a grim acceptance of hunger. Twice she skirted a small hunting party and pressed herself against a trunk until the group passed and the sound of boots died away. Once she heard the hounds bark, and the sound went on as a searching thing, but it never found her. The wood sheltered her, even as it tested her. At a creek, she found a calmer place to rest. She wrapped herself in what remained of a shawl and tried to make shelter from branches and the broad leaves of a fern. She learned to make small fires that smoked unpleasantly, yet kept the damp at bay. She began to recognize the rhythm of light and dark, the way birds spoke of morning, and the way night insects measured the hours to moon. In those hours she sat and thought of the Baron's face, still there, still sure of himself. He had poured the weight of his arrogance onto her like a test, and her life had responded by shifting. She had not been crushed. There were moments when the loneliness settled against her like a living thing. She would press her hands to her body and feel the little movements of the baby and marvel at how fierce that quiet life could be. Often she hummed, a tune so low it might have been a bird call, a single note that kept her steady. The forest gave her food and the creek clean water. It gave her nights of wary sleep. But it could not give her enough bread, nor could it tend the spots where the pigsty had bruised her arms with the stings of rough hands. She wrapped cloth around small abrasions and imagined a future where hands were gentle and not predatory. Her courage was not a single bright flare, but a set of small choices. Keep walking, keep hiding, keep breathing. In the days that followed, she learned the hours when the Baron's men would sweep the fields, mid-morning and just after midday. She learned to avoid smoke that might belong to a camp. She learned to bury her own trail in ways a woman with nothing to lose learns. backing out of a clearing on her own footsteps, so the shape of her movement would be a lie. She learned, too, the names of edible roots and the ones to avoid. In such details, the future lays its foundation. 2 nights before she found the creek where she would finally break, she slept with a rock for a pillow and dreamed of a door that would not open. In the dream, she stood behind it, and someone on the other side hammered and hammered until the wood splintered. She woke with a mouthful of dirt, a rawness at the back of her throat. The sound of someone breaking wood had lodged itself in her memory as a warning. The world can force entry. She resolved in the dream state to be the one who decided when to open doors from then on. It was on the 4th day in a stretch of a shallow valley that she felt the worst of it. The creek's sound was a thin ribbon in the woods at first, but here it widened and the bank was softer. She had taken to walking alongside it because the path was flatter and the thirst was eased. The child inside her had been quiet that day, perhaps content, perhaps also tired of the irregular circadian of a fugitive. Anna felt the cramp again, sudden and colder than the rest had been. She stopped and steadied herself against a thorny bush. The water farther down glittered and called, but she could not make herself go. A nausea rose, and the world for a moment folded into a single bright line. She spoke aloud, a private vow that the trees could not answer. "Hold," she said to the small life she carried, as if that were any sort of command, and laughed then because the act of laughter in that empty valley felt like blasphemy. She slid down a bank and dared herself to breathe, the way a swimmer forces the lungs to calm after a wave. A mist rose from the creek, a bird called somewhere, and the sound was oddly bright, a sound from before she had learned the smell of pigs. She became aware of a new, shadow-thin sensation at the edge of the world, the sense of being watched. It is a sensation that can be imagined into being by fear alone, and for a while she told herself it was only that. After hours of hiding, the senses become raw. But some watchfulness has the shape of a presence, a footfall, a rustle not of leaves, but of someone moving carefully, someone who does not want to startle game or a person. Anna listened, and a small honest hope opened like a wound. If someone had found her, it could be a raiding party taking the reward the Baron had offered. She pictured men with greedy eyes and a torch, men who would take her back like a thing. She ground the toe of her boot into the ground and weighed the sky. The watchfulness moved like someone circling, a movement practiced and careful. The air changed. The shadow of a figure slid between trunks. Anna's hands tightened on her skirts. She considered flight, then thought of the creek and how slippered the bank was, and how a fall now might rip her open and ruin the child. She forced herself to breathe. A voice cut the green air, soft, careful, and not the bark of a man used to commanding others. "Stay very still," it said in a tone that held no hunger. "I'm not one of them." She could have run. She could have cried out for help. Instead, she made the smallest of decisions that would have great consequence. She did as the voice said. Her breath was a match struck slowly. She watched the sun mark on the water and waited. A figure emerged between the trunks, cloak dark as riverstone, a hood shadowing his face. He moved like someone who had spent his days watching from windows and knew how to live with restraint. He halted a few paces away, hands visible and empty, showing he meant no harm. There was a gentleness to the way he looked at her, a softness that came like a cool hand to a fevered brow. His boots made no crack in the leaf litter. He was used to moving without leaving noise. Her first reaction was to be suspicious. Years had taught her distrust as a means of survival, but the man before her did not look at her as property or as a spectacle. There was curiosity in his gaze, and under it, something that felt almost like recognition. Recognition not of her as an individual, but recognition of what had been done to her. He took in the ragged hem of her dress, the way the pigsty had left its mark, the small slope of her belly. He drew in a breath, and the sound of it was like a bell in the hush. "Are you all right?" he asked, not with the bluntness of an overseer, but with the carefulness of someone who feared his words might break what he had come to find. Her voice came out as a whisper. "I will be if I'm not found." He nodded, though that sounded a small thing to do. "Then come." He took a step closer and extended his hand, palm turned upward in the neutral way of someone offering aid rather than command. Anna's mind ran a list, risks and possibilities. She looked at his hand, at the sleeve frayed at the cuff but clean, at the simplicity of his manner, and the lack of the swagger that belonged to those who ruled by fear. She thought of the Baron's laugh, and the ease with which the Baron had made her shame into spectacle. She thought, too, of the child inside her, and of the cold calculation that now went with every decision. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she took his hand. He did not lift her as a conqueror. He drew her slowly toward the deeper shadow of trees, away from the open creek. His hands smelled faintly of cedar and the leather of a saddle. Up close, the lines at his mouth were not cruel. They were grooves of thought and solitude. He spoke quietly as they walked. "My name is Ricardo," he said, and it was as if the syllables themselves were a small offering of identity. "You can call me Duke if you need to, or you can call me Ramon." He caught himself and frowned, perhaps at his slip. "I apologize. I am unused to speaking with those whose lives are hard. I mean only that you are safe with me if you wish." Anna kept her other hand to her stomach. Safety was a word so foreign it shivered on her lips. The world had taught her to read people by what they took. This man, she noticed, took nothing. He offered space. His coat bore a faint badge at the shoulder, a crest cut by time, not ostentation. He was not ostentatious. He moved like someone who had withdrawn from public demands rather than gathered them around himself. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because people help for many reasons: pity, curiosity, a desire to be told they are good." Ricardo's face worked in some small way. He was not used to being asked why. "Because sometimes the world is wrong," he said finally. "And because I know what it is to be watched and not understood. I have room at my house. I have people who can care for you, if you accept it." She could refuse. She could say she would make her way alone down tracks and lanes, until she found shelter in another poor house, another hearth. But the world had a way of ending with a man's hand on your shoulder and the scrape of iron on the gate. Besides, the forest was not a haven when winter takes plan, or when a reward for your capture sits in a baron's pocket. She thought of how the baron would send men for her at dusk, and drag her back to the yard and throw her again into the pigsty as a lesson to others. She thought of the small body sleeping under her ribs, and the way a child's life must be kept from a man who uses power as sport. That thought steadied her more than anything else. "All right," she answered, voice thin but resolute. "I will go." He guided her with care, helping her over a fallen root, steadying her when the ground slid underfoot. In the clean air of the hollow they passed through, Anna allowed herself to notice things she had not permitted in weeks. The way his hands were stained at the fingers from ink, perhaps if he wrote letters, or from work done with wood. There was no show in his manner. There was instead an economy of motion that suggested a life unburdened by arrogance. He moved like someone who had learned restraint, not because of fear but because of thought. The way he looked at the land told her something else. He was not the baron who prized quantity and signage. He watched the trees as if they were companions, not property. That impressed her more than the offer of shelter ever could. When they reached a path cleared of brambles, he signaled with a hand and motioned that they should keep quiet. They walked for a while in a silence that was comfortable. The forest stitched their shadows together, and the distant sounds of life went on, birdsong, a far-off bray of cattle, with neither of them pretending that the world was private. He spoke of small things, where the stream ran wider, where the land opened to a road. He told her nothing of his title at first, tending instead to the map of the land, like a man who knew it by memory, and had found in his care a pleasure that was not pride. Once, at a bend, he hesitated and asked softly, "Do you have anyone waiting for you?" "No," she said. The word landed like a stone. He did not ask more. Some questions, he seemed to understand, were like a wound you did not probe further. The path they took rose and dipped, coming to a gradual slope that smelled of moss. Anna noticed then a change in the air. The world seemed ordered, not by overseers and men in fine boots, but by roofs and chimneys far off, by a silence that suggested restraint more than watchfulness. A house or castle, she thought. The idea now loomed like a promise on the horizon. As the trees thinned, they revealed the shadow of a wall, a stretch of grey stone covered with ivy. Its top cut the sky in an even line. Beyond it, A tower caught the last line of afternoon sun, and a narrow window was lit as if it had been waiting for them. The sound of a bell, a low single tone, came from somewhere within. For a moment Anna's body relaxed in a way she had not known was possible. The place did not shout its presence. It kept to itself like someone who had learned to speak in a whisper. That was enough. Ricardo led her to a gate where a single man waited, a warder with a lantern and the look of someone who had been told to expect unusual things. He took one look at Anna and his face softened. "You must be Duke Ricardo," he said, more statement than question. "That is me," Ricardo answered, "and this woman is in need." The warder, whose name she would later know, Elias, moved with the easy competence of someone who had seen the seasons turn many times. He did not ask for proof, did not eye Anna as a curiosity. He led them through an arched gateway into a courtyard, where the smell of wood smoke and soap replaced the rank tang of barns. In the courtyard, a woman with flour-dusted hands and a face like a warm hearth stood wiping her palms. She introduced herself without ceremony as Marta, and from her expression Anna understood what it was to be received without questions that cut. They took Anna inside, up a flight of stone steps warmed in places by the sun. The castle, if that is what one could call it, was less the carved grandeur of the Baron's Hall and more a place that had collected useful things and learned to be comfortable with them. It smelled of herbs and bread, of clean laundry, of soot not too stubborn. A small fire burned beneath a pan, and the sound of a child's laughter floated faintly from a corridor. For the first time in days, Anna thought she might not be seen as a thing to be punished. Ricardo closed the door softly behind them, and for a moment stood by the threshold watching. There was a distance in his face that suggested a man used to the solitude of rooms. He turned to Marta. "See that she is tended. Water, clean linens. Make a bed. Quiet. She needs quiet." Marta, a woman whose hands were broad and sure, nodded and set to work. She covered Anna with a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender, and when Anna bent toward the child's movements, Marta's fingers found her wrist and squeezed in a way that said, "Without words, you are expected to be strong, but you are allowed to be weak for a while." As Marta moved about, Ricardo stepped near as if to examine the map of her injuries and the arc of her fear without touching it. "You do not have to tell me anything you don't want to," he said, the tone of a man who had learned to hold his questions tenderly. "If you need time to rest—" "How did you know I was here?" she asked before she could stop herself. It was the question that had lodged in her mind like a thorn. He hesitated, then smiled in a way that could have been shyness. "I saw you from the top of a ridge," he said. "I ride sometimes to clear my head. I saw the movement by the creek. I came down to see if it was a fox or a stag, and found instead a woman. I had seen signs of the Baron's men passing through recently, posters, men at the inn. I thought, there are people in this world who need room to breathe. Perhaps I can be that." Her mouth shaped a laugh that sounded like surprise and relief braided together. "You gave me a choice," she said, and the words were a small thing, but they meant everything. She had expected to be commanded, told where to sleep and what chores to do, as if the shelter would itself be a bargain to be enforced. Instead, she had a choice, and that opened a small, fierce crack in her iron reserve. Ricardo watched her, and for the first time his face softened not from curiosity, but from something like recognition of a shared exile. He had, she would later learn, been a man who carried his own wounds like a map folded into his pocket. For now, in the hush of the stone corridor warmed by wood smoke, he knelt to take a bowl of broth Marta brought and set it near Anna. "Eat when you are ready," he said. "We will make you comfortable." She did not eat much. The soup was thin but warm, and the spoon trembled in her hand. Marta's motion, so practiced, so efficient, mended some of the bruises the pigsty had made. She held a cloth to a raw skin and hummed, and the sound was like a thread pulling loose the seam of fear. Anna slept in waves. When she woke, there was the sound of footsteps outside, Elias making a round, and a small child's voice called for water. The noises of domestic life were at once strange and kind. They told her that the world could hold rhythms that were gentler than the Baron's displays. Ricardo moved around the space like a man who had once been unwilling to make commitments and now was trying with careful practice to keep them. He did not rescue in the way stories often tell rescues, No loud declarations, no grandstanding, but in quiet actions, a blanket arranged with deliberate care, a bowl refilled with broth, a lantern brought so she would not wake in the dark. When dusk fell and the wind drew long shadows through the window, he sat by the hearth as if mounting a guard, though his eyes watched not the doorway, but the woman asleep on the pallet. When she stirred, he covered her shoulders with the blanket and said, almost as if speaking to himself, "Rest, the night will not bother you here." She slept and the castle breathed, and in the morning light the world seemed to belong to her for the briefest of moments. She walked slowly through the corridor and found that a suite of rooms had been given for her and the child, small but private. There were linen closets and a wash basin and a large chest where she could put the few things she owned. Marta showed her how to use the basin and where to hang the clothes so they would dry in the warmth of the kitchen. Simple instructions, ordinary kindnesses, had the power of miracles when one had been thrown into filth and told to accept disgrace. Later that day, from a small shuttered window, Anna saw the land spread out, a crop field to the east, a line of elms toward the road, and further away the small shapes of hamlets that watched the Baron's estate. She traced a finger along the sill as if charting the distance between what had been and what might be. Ricardo stood behind her, not intruding, just present. "You are safe here," he said. The words did what hands could not yet do. They provided a simple geometry where fear had once been the only language. Anna glanced at him, and something like a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. It was not an indulgent, romantic smile. It was the tiny, stubborn curve of a mouth that had decided it would persist. "I will be," she answered, and the vow was quieter than it was certain. The night beyond the walls still held a threat. The Baron would not be content to let something he had humiliated remain unknown. Somewhere posters might already be curling with the offer of a reward. But for the first time in a long while there was someone who would stand between her and that threat. Outside, the wind wrote himself across the lanes. Inside the castle, Marta hummed, and Elias mended a harness, and Ricardo closed a door with a sound like a question answered. The child within her shifted, and she felt the movement as a tiny fist against the soft inside of her hand. She pressed her palm to her belly and thought of the pigsty and of the cold steel of a baron's mind. She repeated in a whisper that was both prayer and promise a new name she had not yet said aloud, Hope. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The quiet in that room was not the empty hush of abandonment. It was the heavy, comfortable quiet of a place that had learned to be hospitable. Anna watched the light curve on the old stone and felt something unwind in her chest. But the world beyond the walls was not so gentle. In the kitchen below, a steward named Gaspar bent over a ledger and read the latest rumor. The Baron had posted a reward, a folded paper tacked to tavern doors and inn-posts in the nearby crossroads. "Reward for the return of the woman who fled the Pur estate," the line said in blunt letters, followed by the sum and the Baron's seal. The ink bled where rain had tried already to blur the edges. Gaspar let out a low breath, and the sound rolled through the kitchen like someone closing a door. Ricardo looked up from the table where he had been planning seed rotations and the small repairs that the winter would demand. The map he had been studying lay half forgotten beneath a spoon. "How much?" he asked. "Too much," Gaspar answered. "Enough to feed a dozen men for a month and to tempt more than a dozen men who know the price of other folks' miseries." Ricardo closed his hand over the map as if to contain the small paper world he'd been shaping. The news had weight. It rearranged the geometry of choices. He had hoped the Baron would grumble and nurse his humiliation privately. Instead, the Baron had turned humiliation into bounty, and rumor into a hunt. Anna heard the exchange from the stairwell as she came down to fetch water. The name of the Baron landed in her short breath like a stone. The reaction in the household was immediate, though composed. Marta's fingers tightened on a pot. Elias straightened, the shadow at his jaw sharpening. "We must be cautious," Marta said, not speaking to Ricardo so much as to the room. "Word travels on the road faster than truth." Anna felt the old muscle of fear coil in her ribs, but it was joined now by a different current, an increasing, steady pulse of resolve. The child beneath her ribs, Hope, she had already whispered it aloud a few times when no one listened, kicked as if in answer. There was work to be done that did not involve running. Ricardo rose and walked to the window. The courtyard outside lay quiet as a held breath. A few men watched the servants at work, and a child chased a stray dog as if they could not yet imagine a storm. "We will not hide," he said finally, the words steady as iron. "We will prepare." He did not promise impossible protection. He could not make the Baron's greed vanish. What he could do was make it hard for those who desired to take what was not theirs, and make plain the cost they would pay for violence against those under his roof. That calculus was not just military, it was moral and practical. He sent Elias to secure the outer gate, and requisition extra tar and casks for boiling oil. He asked Marta to gather linens and her sharp eye to prepare a room for birthing sooner than they might have guessed. He set Gaspar to copying the ledger of supplies and marking who could sew, who could hold a bow, who could carry a stretcher. In small actions, the household reconfigured into a community of defense. Anna watched him, not the man of privilege who arrived with polished boots, but the one who became deliberate and steady in the work of protecting others. She found herself cataloguing the change, not as a child who worships a rescuer, but as someone noting how a person learns to bear responsibility. There was softness in the way he listened to Marta's counsel about how to make beds so that a woman in labor could move without pain. There was a tension when Elias showed him how to set up a simple barricade at the northern post. He was learning to be more than solitude's owner. He was learning to be a steward. They brought Anna to the infirmary more often than the others. Marta taught her to sit with herbs and grasp the breath of pain without letting panic rule. Ricardo would sit across the room and read, letters sometimes, more often a chronicle of weather and seed, so his voice would be present but not intrusive. They spoke when they needed to. Often they sat in silence while the castle performed its small chores, and the light found new places on stone. As the weeks passed, the household grew into its roles. Posters of the Baron's reward rippled the lanes, pasted on a tavern door, nailed to a post outside the mill, folded into stacks and passed through hands in the marketplace. Men spied the inked seal and trod paths between farms with a different purpose. Some came in small groups, brazen and promising, only to find the gate shut and the warder's eyes unsympathetic. Others lurked along lanes and asked casual questions about travelers or an escaped servant. Gaspar would always produce a thin ledger and a patient face and say he had not seen such a woman, truth and stubbornness braided into a refusal. Once a messenger arrived breathless, bearing a copy of the Baron's proclamation with a flourish that suggested both compliance and a touch of mischief. He asked for coin as if his reading of the posting were a service that deserved payment. Ricardo paid the messenger, but not in the coin he expected. He paid him with food for his journey and a quiet invitation. "Tell them we have no reason to aid the Baron." Rumors shifted into threat. A small group of men, emboldened by the promise of reward, camped in the hedge lines at night and fired torches to see if the castle's lights would reply. Ricardo had his men patrol the perimeters more often, but kept the defenses conservative. No showmanship, only discipline. They tended the catapults of small scale, pulleys and ropes to move barricades quickly, rather than lavish siege engines. The world outside seemed to gather itself, the Baron pressing his own pride into action like a trigger. During those weeks, Anna's belly grew rounder and the pace of her steps slowed. The work of keeping herself well was small and long, rubbing oil into tired hips, laying warm compresses when the muscles grew unkind, eating when Marta insisted, and refusing to explain why sometimes her appetite fled. In private, she would press a hand to the child and murmur the name that had become a promise, hope, and the small thing would move as if to say, "I am here." Their relationship with Ricardo deepened, not as a singular romance at first, but as an accumulation of shared tasks and quiet witness. Anna began to tell more of her story in fragments, the way a river leaks into a hollow. She spoke of João's laugh and the day he had been taken. She spoke of the small rebellions she had practiced, stealing back a loaf to feed a child, hiding a man's coat so he might keep dignity on a wedding day. Ricardo listened, and his hand sometimes hovered just an inch from her shoulder, as if to steady, not to claim. He admitted some of his own loneliness in return. A house of stone that had once been full of voices but which had learned to keep silence when grief closed the doors. Neither of them sought to turn the other into their salvation. They learned to be companions in a life of deliberate care. The castle's defenses became less about walls than about people. There were lessons in forming that resistance. The baker, who hid sacks of flour when trouble came, a shepherd who lent his dogs to the gate, 2 teenage boys given bows and instructed in taking shelter behind the parapet. Ricardo crafted hours for training, short, purposeful practice sessions with bow and pike, so the household could move as a single living thing. They rehearsed the closing of gates, the shifting of barrels to make a line of obstacle, the quiet signaling of watchmen. In the practice, their fear was given useful shape. One evening, months to the day after Anna had been thrown into the pigsty, a rider came galloping in with the Baron's colours wet with travel. He carried a letter for Ricardo and wore a face hammered flat by the kind of duty that is its own punishment. The rider dismounted and handed the folded paper to Gaspar with a rigour that suggested he had left more than a town behind. He left behind the part of himself that could be called easy. The letter inside was brief and barbed. It demanded the surrender of the woman who had fled and used the language of law to hide the hunger of revenge. Return the fugitive and be compensated for harbouring her, or suffer the Baron's displeasure. It suggested that the Baron might raise a banner and march if denied. Ricardo read the words, then folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. He did not show the anger that threatened at the base of his throat. Instead, he composed himself and invited the rider to stay until morning. The rider refused with a curt shake of his head and rode off into the dusk with his complaint clipping the air like a warning. "We must assume he will come," Elias said, voice low. "He is not a man for idle threats." Anna felt the world tilt. Her fingers on the hem of a linen folded tightened. The child moved as if responding to the rising tempo. She thought of the pigsty and the bartering of body and shame. She thought of how little the Baron had counted the life that had been placed in his judgment. The knowledge that he might come to take that life became a kind of furnace. It burned away some of the hesitancy she still carried and left behind a hardened decision. "You will not make me leave," she said that evening to Ricardo, not as a plea but as a statement. He looked at her, and somewhere in his chest a cord twined with hope. "You will not leave unless you choose to," he replied, "and you will have the voice in that choice." She accepted the offer of the night to sleep near the inner hall, where the sounds of the household could be counted, like a litany to keep fear at bay. Marta braided her hair back and tucked a clean cloth beneath her head. Elias checked the hinges on the inner gate and set a small sentinel where he thought a man might attempt a hidden approach. They strapped leather around rations, and Ricardo walked among the men with a calm he did not feel, speaking soft orders and checking that the shields were mended and that ropes were coiled neatly. There was a new thing in him, a readiness to stand at the front of a small group not for glory, but because someone else's life depended on it. The attack came on a morning when the sky was thin with cloud. The first sign was not a trumpet, but the sound of horns from the far lane and the distant clatter of horses. The household sprang into motion like a thing that had rehearsed its own heartbeat. Men climbed the walls, gripped pikes, set hot oil in small cauldrons and practiced the terrible economy of defense. Children were sent to the cellar with blankets and bread. Marta gathered the women and showed them how to hold a lantern, how to seal a door, how to fashion a makeshift bandage. The castle smelled of smoke and flour and iron. It smelled like a place that had become capable of keeping a promise at cost. Outside the Baron's standard, an arrogant thing of black and red, rose over a ragged procession of men. They were fewer than a proper army, but many enough to test a small stronghold. The banner hung heavy with the Baron's certainty. He rode mounted, his armored boots shining like accusations, his face carved into the hard lines of a man used to being obeyed. Beside him rode captains with rough faces and men with the look of those who take rewards as a trade. He had not come with siege engines. He had come with men who thought they could shock and scare and then claim their prize. The first volleys were not of cannon but of arrows and shouts. The Baron's men tried to scale the outer palisade with ladders. They hurled stones to distract the defenders. Ricardo had prepared for this. He had his archers ready along the parapet, and they rained arrows on the ladders and the men who tried to lift them. Boiling oil hissed where it landed. A terrible sound meant more to frighten than to glorify. The defenders fought with a fierce economy of motion, not a careless bravado. Anna watched from the inner keep. The sound of battle had become a new, terrible music. She had been tempted to flee early the first time she heard men on the lane. This time she remained because the child was soon to come, and because leaving would hand victory to the Baron. Her hands found a bandage, and she stood with Marta and a few women near the infirmary, ready to assist. When a wounded man was carried in, an arrow through the shoulder, his face a map of shock, Anna steadied him with unflinching hands and felt in the act a part of herself rearrange. She was not only protected, she was a protector too. The battle ebbed and flowed. The attackers sought to find any weakness. They tried to set fire to a thatch on the outer buildings, while other men attempted to batter the gate. Elias led a night sortie to cut ropes of a ladder in the hedge line. Gaspar's quick thinking saved a small group when he misdirected a band of scouts into a marshy patch where their horses bogged. The defenses were not perfect, but they were smart. They used the narrowness of approach to their advantage, forcing the attackers into choke points, where numbers counted for less. At the heart of the assault was the Baron's need to make the humiliation personal. He moved like a man who needed to reclaim what he thought belonged to him, not merely as a policy, but as an affirmation of his world. He directed men with a cruelty that disguised itself as discipline, and when a bomberman tried to set a flaming brand against the gate, the Baron's shout cut across the battle like a call to prey. Ricardo faced him from the parapet, with the bluntness of two different kinds of power observing one another. The Baron called for surrender in a voice that carried over the din. Ricardo answered instead, with a call for them to lay down their arms and remove their leader's reasons. The rhetoric changed nothing. In the third hour of the assault, the attackers pressed harder. A group found a sally port that had been poorly braced and tried to wedge the door. A struggling breach began to appear in the outer defenses, where smoke and flying debris made vision poor. Ricardo found himself pushed into decisions that were not in any manual he had read, to risk men in a counterattack, or to hold positions and conserve strength. He chose the former. A small sharp sortie led by Elias struck the men at their flank, scattering them until the line reformed. The Baron, seeing his momentum checked, took his own horse and rode forward, as if the example of his body could replace strategy. The two men came to meet across a yard muddied with haste and the tracks of horses. The Baron dismounted with theatrical anger, his hand on the pommel of a sword that had cut many threats into obedience. Ricardo met him with a spear, his stance defensive but firm. They circled like two animals who had learned to speak in steel. For a moment, the field hushed, a space created where the fate of a woman and a small child would be decided in the blunt measure of blade and breath. Anna had come to the parapet when the Baron rode forward. The sight of him, his face flushed, eyes hungry, was like an old shore of fear revisited. She clenched her hands until her knuckles whitened, but she did not beg Ricardo to stay. He had chosen to stand where the line needed him. She had chosen to stay where they needed her. The choice was a shared currency that belonged to no one man. The duel was not a grand spectacle. It was grinding and deliberate. The Baron struck with the heavy arrogance of someone used to buying victory. Ricardo answered with the patient, practiced movements of someone who had learned how to defend a small life. They exchanged blows that were neither cinematic nor heroic in the legends. They were work done by two men with raw intentions. Where the Baron sought to wound for domination, Ricardo aimed to disarm and end the threat. In a moment that would later be retold in small, careful ways around fires and in kitchens, Ricardo found an opening. The Baron, breath hot and wild, overreached on a strike that carried the weight of his rage rather than the craft of war. Ricardo stepped inside the blow, turned his shoulder, and with a quick, clean motion wrested the Baron's arm aside and struck with the flat of his blade. The shock was not to kill but to break the arrogance. The blow found a place near the Baron's ribs and folded him into a gasp. He fell to his knees as if someone had cut the string that held him upright. Silence fled into the yard with the sound of men exhaling. Those who followed the Baron saw a leader unseated and felt the tide shift. Some fled, others knelt, as if at the sight of a god losing his temper. The captains tried to rally them, but the cohesive will that a leader like the Baron inspires had been undermined. Ricardo stood over the fallen man and kept the tip of his blade close, but not cruel. "Enough," Ricardo said, voice steady, not triumphant. "Take him. He will not die here, but he will not walk free." The surrender that followed was not theatrical. The remaining men dropped arms and matched their surrender to a sense that the cost of continuing would be ruin. They were given terms: detention, the possibility of judgment under the law Ricardo would now see applied with fairness, and then they were marched under guard to the inner courtyard, where they were bound and watched. Anna went down into the yard when the last of the Baron's men had been secured. She found the Baron slumped on a crate, his grandeur flayed by sudden pain and the knowledge of defeat. He looked at her then, not with the old contempt, but with the baffled anger of someone who had been denied his expectation. He spat words that were more venom than sentence, and she met them with a steadiness that had its own force. "You thought you could end me," she said, the sentence soft but full. She had no need to be loud. The words were the quiet measurement of one who had lived through spectacle and come out the other side. The Baron tried to retort, to brand her as property even in his humiliation, but Ricardo stepped between them. He would not allow that final cruelty. Instead, he ordered that the Baron be held and that an assessment be done the next day, a proper inquiry with witnesses, a decision made with law and not with the whim of muscle. The aftermath of the battle smelled of smoke and scorched cloth and the copper tang of blood. Men tended wounds with an economy of practiced hands. Marta and Anna worked together to cloth the hurt. Gaspar accounted for what stores had been used and what needed to be bought. There was relief, yes, but also a sober note. Defense had come at a cost. The walls would need repair. The fields near the lane had been trampled in the attack. The household gathered to mark the losses and set steps to rebuild. Ricardo did not treat the victory as a private triumph. He gathered the captured men in the great hall and ordered them not to be executed or abused. Instead, he had them bound and given food. He appointed a small council, with Elias Marta Gaspar, a local magistrate who had seen the streams of justice muddied by money, and 2 tenants from the hamlet who represented the people who worked the land, to determine what would follow. The Baron would be held pending trial. His men would be given the option to labor to repair damage or to be handed over to lawful process. It was a strange and delicate thing to let justice be more than revenge. The community needed to be shown that law could reckon with cruelty without becoming another cruelty. The council drafted simple reforms, a commitment to fairer rents on the land they managed, a pledge that no person could be taken as property or sold for a debt without testimony, and provisions for those who had been abused to seek refuge. It was not utopia. Structural change is never a sudden unrolling, but it was a beginning that would anchor the estate to a different set of values. Anna watched those proceedings with a cautious wonder. She had offered testimony, not as a victim to be wrapped in pity, but as someone with information and a lived claim. She spoke of the pigsty and of the Baron's proclamation without letting her voice become a spectacle. Her words were direct and small, and they landed like stones in a stream, not to drown the man, but to redirect the flow. The Baron sat in the dim of the guardroom, stripped of his finery, and forced into the ordinary posture of a man who had known only the luxury of command. He could not fully grasp how his act of humiliation had turned into this machine of accountability. In his mind he had not beaten a person, he had only enforced order. The notion that his choice had been a kindling for something else, love, law, reform, was outside his faculties. He had counted humiliation as annihilation. Instead, the humiliation had birthed a life that would not fold under command. In the weeks that followed, the castle became the axis of slow repair. They rebuilt walls that had been breached and planted hedges to make lanes less hospitable to ambush. They created a small hold for the Baron's prisoners, where they were fed and kept but treated humanely, their status a reflection of the new rules under which Ricardo insisted the estate would operate. He formed a council of oversight that included the tenants, because he believed that governance divorced from those it governed was the breeding ground of cruelty. The tenants, at first wary, found a voice in decisions about who would tend which field and how rents could be measured not as extraction, but as mutual obligation. Anna's child was born on a night when the air tasted like rain, and the house seemed to hold its breath in a gentler way than it had during the assault. The midwife, martyr hardened by years of bread and bandages, moved with a competence that made the room into a small theatre of care. Ricardo was close by, not imposing, but present. Elias had fetched warm cloths and sat with hands folded. The work was not cinematic. It was intimate and feral and utterly human. Anna labored with a bravery that was not the stuff of heroics, but of endurance, the kind of courage formed in the quiet making of life. When the child came, she cried with a voice that filled the room with the smallest insistence. Anna held her, breathless and whole in a way that had not been possible amid fear. The child's skin smelled like milk and birch sap. Her hands curled around Anna's finger with a force that seemed older than both of them. They named her Hope, in a low agreed whisper that carried all the freight of the past months and the tentative promises of the future. Ricardo dipped his head as if in prayer without language, and placed a hand over both mother and child with an expression that was both reverence and the guard of one who will keep what he must protect. After the birth, they organized care not as charity but as shared labor. The household took turns tending to the infant by night so mothers could rest. They sewed a small cradle from spare wood and carved a pattern on it, not as a mark of ownership, but as a reminder that Hope belonged to the community that had held her into being. Those small rituals stitched the people together. Days melted into months. The estate under Ricardo's stewardship changed in ways that were visible and invisible. He insisted on auditing rents and forgiving small debts rendered vicious by long years of extraction. He appointed a steward from among the tenants to help manage the fields. He established a small fund to help women like Anna, who had nowhere else to turn. The changes were not sudden but cumulative. They altered how a place thought about itself. The workers began to sing in the fields again, and not only from habit but with a small, genuine lightness. Anna and Ricardo's relationship deepened, not in declarations, but in the accrual of small mercies. He learned to mend cloth with the economy of hands that had not been trained for such tenderness. She taught him how to coax a laugh out of Hope when the child's face had been made a serious thing by too many adults. Love, when it grew between them, was not a rescue narrative overlay. It was a kinship born of shared work and mutual choice. Yet the presence of the Baron outside the walls was not entirely erased by the defeat. He remained a prisoner at the castle, under guard, and subject to charges laid by a council convened with the local magistrate. The trial was a rough thing. Men of the Baron's station did not easily find themselves examined under law, but in the presence of witnesses, in the accounts of those who had seen his cruelty, and with Ricardo refusing to misuse his power, the verdict was one that shocked some and satisfied others. The Baron was stripped of his titles and holdings relevant to the local holdings. In place of cruel oversight, he was to be held to make reparations. He would be compelled to fund the repairs to damaged holdings he had assaulted and to give a portion of his stock to those he had abused. He would be bound under supervision. His name would no longer carry weight in the same counties. For a man to be forced from the pedestal of authority into a life of ordinary accountability was a kind of humiliation that could be argued as justice. When the sentence was read, the Baron spat and threatened. He tried to rally malcontents in the surrounding lands, but found the Baron's old grip had been loosened. The people who had once let him rule out of fear or habit found a new measure of what they could ask for. Some men returned to their farms with a reluctance that would thin with time. Others said that it was finally possible to look to a future that was not arranged around a man's whim. The estate that had been a model of authoritarian order slowly shifted toward something more durable. Ricardo instituted councils that included workers. They met beneath a plain room with benches and a long table. Decisions were made in the open. Who would be offered seed in spring? Which fields might be left fallow for the soil to recover? How to share the workload of harvest with communities that had once been exploited? It was not immediately fair in every instance, but it was open. People argued and corrected and required compromises. In the friction, the estate found new muscles. Hope grew into a child who knew the castle's stones as much as the fields. She laughed with the servants and snatched at Ricardo's sleeve with the same freedom she used when she tugged at Anna's skirts. Anna watched her, and sometimes thought of that night in the pigsty, the mud and the smell, and felt the distance shrink. What had been a moment of extreme degradation had indeed become, in a long and winding way, the kernel of a new life. Outside the castle, the Baron's name remained a smudge. He was alive and watched, and not forgotten entirely. But the thing that had been purchased with his arrogance, the community's fear, had been diluted by the steady work of law and the stubborn kindness of ordinary labor. The decision to treat the captured men with restraint instead of vengeance sent ripples through neighboring estates. The local magistrate took notes and used the case as a foundation for arguing that a lord's power must be balanced by customary rights and legal accountability. It was, in its slow fashion, the beginning of a structural change that might be small in the scheme of kingdoms, but vast in the lives of those who tilled the earth. Years later, when Anna stood at the edge of a field and watched Hope chase a stray dog among the wheat, she sometimes thought of the strange arithmetic of beginnings. The pigsty remained a dark hinge in memory, one that hurt if summoned too long, yet it had been the pivot on which the rest of her life turned. Men's attempts to reduce her to spectacle had been transformed into a demand for justice. She had not been rescued into dependency. She had been invited and had accepted to build a life that bore dignity. Ricardo and she built a home that was not a fortress against all the world, but a place that could hold dissent and debate and children's laughter. They were not without grief or struggle. There were nights when they worried about the thinness of grain after a bad season, and days when the cost of reform seemed too large. But the community that had risen to defend them now sat at a table where voices equalized with the measure of what needed to be done. The estate employed a council that included workers and neighbors. They taught apprentices and paid wages that could be counted on, and they set aside a fund to repair wrongs and to help those displaced by debts. In the evenings, Ricardo would sometimes walk the line of the field with Anna, and they would talk in soft pragmatism about crops and the small things of running a place where people lived in dignity. He did not grow vain with the task. He grew, instead, into a kind of fidelity that was not a vow made to one person alone, but a commitment to a way of life. The Baron lived out his days under supervision, his title effectively nullified in those places where it had mattered. Stripped of command, he was forced into a life of ordinary consequence. He had failed to realize that humiliation applied not merely to the subject, but to the one who misuses power. The attempt to crush another circulates an energy that can shape things in unpredicted ways. In the end, his rage had been the opening that allowed a new set of structures to form. Structures that would take time to harden into law and habit, but would eventually hold. Hope, as she grew, learned names and duties. She learned that the history of her birth, a child born in the breach between cruelty and care, was not a tormented tale, but a story of insistence. She was read to under the same roofs servants used for their meals. She was allowed to run with the stable boys and to dab at a wound with the same patience their parents had shown when it mattered. That egalitarian growing up was the living lesson her mother and Ricardo had chosen to model. On a spring evening years later, when the barley was knee-high and the air smelled of blossom, Anna visited the edge of the lane where once the Baron had tacked up a sheet promising a price. There was no paper now. The post had been mended into a sign that listed the council's meeting times. Children played in the hedgerow. A neighbor waved from his cart, and the exchange was friendly and plain. She stood for a long time and let the wind pass over her, feeling the pulse of a world altered by small and steady decisions. She thought, with no triumph and no resentment, of the pigsty. The memory remained like an old scar that could no longer define her. The throwing had been intended as an erasure, but instead it had been a spark. The force of one man's cruelty had set in motion the courage of many, a reclusive duke who learned to govern with tenderness, servants who learned they deserved protection, neighbors who found a claim on their own dignity. The child who had been name-claimed as Hope had become the living measure of all those decisions. Ricardo took her hand as they stood in the lane. His fingers were calloused now from work as well as care. He did not make grand speeches. He simply said, "You turned what was meant to bury you into something that would protect more than us." Anna smiled in a way that belonged to someone who had cultivated both tenderness and a fierce clarity. "They thought they ended a thing," she said. "Instead, they opened a door." The castle, its walls patched and its hedges braided with young trees, rested as a place of possible safety where people could come and be heard. The reforms were imperfect but active. The law had been tested, and in a small region had been shown to be more than a tool of the powerful. The legacy Ricardo and Anna cultivated was not an edict but a practice. Ask, listen, change. On the anniversary of the day Anna had been cast into the muck, she walked with hope to the place where the pigsty had stood, no longer used as before. Some buildings had been repurposed into storage for seed and a shelter for passing travelers. They built a small bench there and placed a simple plaque reading only, "For those who were deemed nothing, for those who chose otherwise." Hope, a child now with hair like the wheat in summer, climbed onto the bench and looked out toward the field. She laughed and said something that made Anna's chest loosen in a way that felt like prayer without words. All around them the estate moved in ordinary rhythms, a horse's whinny, a woman calling from the lane, the steady sound of scythes in the field. When the wind came, it carried a smell of earth and bread. Anna thought of the line the Baron had once drawn between owner and owned, and how narrow that line had been, until people refused to accept it. She knew there would be days when the work would require courage, and others when the insistence of fairness would frustrate the timid. But she also knew there was a sturdier possibility now, a life where the dignity of a person mattered more than a man's appetite. They had been thrown to the pigs, and the world had watched as if humiliation could be sealed into a life. That act of cruelty had been meant to mark an end. It had not ended anything but ignorance. In its wake, it had loosened a new beginning, a small revolution of ordinary care that would be sibylline and slow and thorough. If this story gave you hope, share it with someone who needs a reminder that when power is used to humiliate, resistance can take shape in unexpected kindnesses, and that the beginning of change often begins with a single person choosing not to be erased.